It may not be Star Trek Voyager Elite Force, but might actually be better? Okay, that was a terrible intro, but I just kind of wanted to show this off. I got this, like, Star Trek Nerf rifle. It is huge. It is much bigger than you think it is from this video, and it's freaking awesome. I just had to show it off. Anyways, this actually has nothing to do with what I'm reviewing today, because today I am reviewing one of the newest Star Trek video games, Star Trek Resurgence from Dramatic Labs. Yes, I know I am long in coming with this review. This game actually came out several months ago, but I didn't actually get to finish the game because I've been so damn busy making my own movie identities, and I started the game, I even played it on stream a little bit, but didn't get around to finishing it until recently. And that's on me, because this game is actually fantastic, and I need to talk about this game with y'all, because it is truly, truly wonderful, and a must-play experience for Trekkies. To be very clear, this game is a narrative-heavy experience, so I am not going to be talking spoilers about the game, at least up front. There is one big spoiler that I really, really want to talk about because it had me so freaking excited when I learned what it was and what they were doing with the story, but I'll give a big warning at the back half of this review when I talk about that, but I really need to discuss it. That being said, for those of you who don't know what Star Trek Resurgence is, Star Trek Resurgence is a game kind of in the vein of the old Telltale games like The Walking Dead or Tales from the Borderlands, if you played those back on like the Xbox 360 era. I loved those games, adored them, but sadly the company that made them, Telltale Games, at least as its iteration in those times was, went away, mainly because, you know, the company was making very bad business choices as well as not upgrading their engine, and the engine having a lot of like stuttering problems as the company went along that was less and less forgivable with each release. But that being said, I really adored those games and thought that they had some of the best writing, and Star Trek Resurgence is not only in the same vein, but actually written and made by some of the former Telltale devs that came over to form Dramatic Labs. So it has a lot of the same DNA. So if you played those games, you pretty much know exactly what you're going to get with Star Trek Resurgence in terms of the gameplay. And I will say, as a negative right up front, that does come with some of the jitteriness of those games. There is a lot of the like jank that those games had that I would have hoped that a game made, you know, several years after all of those would not have, but sadly they are still here. So if that is the thing that bugs you and bugged you about the Telltale games, that is present here. For me, I'm a little nostalgic for it. I'm a little willing to forgive that sort of thing for the excellence that is everything else around this, but that is there for those of you who don't know. But the narrative of this game is set in a sort of post-Deep Space Nine, post-Deep Dominion War era of Star Trek, kind of in that ground between the end of the Dominion War and Star Trek Lower Decks, Star Trek Picard kind of era that we're getting with the new Star Trek shows. They even have like the old DS9, like gray jumpsuit uniforms that are my personal favorite jumpsuit, and we are taking place on a new starship completely separate from everything else called the USS Resolute, as they go on this mission to sort of negotiate a sort of dispute between two civilizations, doing like Federation Starfleet stuff. And what's even more fun about this story is that you get to play as two distinct characters. You get to play as Commander Rychek, who is the brand new first officer of the Resolute, as well as I believe he's a Lieutenant Diaz, one of the engineers down in the lower decks. And what's really fun about that dynamic is it not only allows you to see two aspects of a Starfleet ship, like getting to be on the bridge, but then also getting all the nitty-gritty of like running around Jeffries tubes and all that stuff. But what's even more fun is because you're playing a high-ranking commander on the ship and a low-ranking person on the ship, you kind of get like how one affects the other. So like, especially early in the game, you'll make decisions as the commander that will then affect what happens to the lower decks crew member that like could cause injuries and things like that. And you get to like kind of see that like that interesting sort of influence of, you know, a hierarchical structure that Starfleet has that I thought was really interesting to kind of play with. And that is kind of mirrored in the situation that you get to deal with when you go to this planet, because it is sort of a labor dispute. You kind of have one alien civilization that is sort of controlling another one, and they use them for labor, and there was a revolt in the mines that, you know, they seized the means of production against those other aliens and sort of trying to mediate that dispute. And it also, this story actually implicates the Federation as well, because they technically are a third impartial observer, but they do have some vested interest in having this mine come back to work because we get some resources out of it. So there's interesting sort of discussions of colonialism and like labor. Like this game actually has some things to say both within Starfleet with like the, you know, lower decks versus upper decks dichotomy, as well as in the story itself, that I thought was utterly fascinating. And that is just the beginning of this story. Again, I won't spoil just yet. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a little while, but the ties into some of Star Trek lore and some of the weird, like they pull in this game game from some really weird and strange aspects of Star Trek lore that I thought no one would ever touch again, and make it some of the most deepest, most interesting, and most out there Star Trek moments I have ever seen. Like, the ending of this game and where this game goes and the twists and turns it takes you in are things that I did not expect, and yet draw from Star Trek lore in a really unique way, and even take characters that I never thought would ever, like, anyone would do anything with, and made them some of the most dynamic, interesting people in Star Trek. Again, I do not want to spoil for you, but they go on some wild tangents in this game that I thought were so freaking cool. And then I also just love, like, again, in Telltale Style, you have to deal with the dynamics of, like, working with different crew members, dealing with the dynamics of, like, being a commander, like how do you deal with someone who's, like, kind of an asshole to you, but sometimes right, and he sort of gives you shit, and so what do you do with that crew member? How do you deal with a captain who may be more worried about his reputation than on what's needs to be done at hand in this situation? Like, how do you navigate all those? And so there's some good interpersonal dynamics here that feel very Deep Space Nine. Gene Roddenberry probably rolling his grave because there's interpersonal conflict on a starship, but I think it makes a lot of sense, and again, feels very Deep Space Nine in its approach to its characterization of Starfleet officers, but in a very kind of hopeful way that I found really, really interesting. And yeah, some of the choices in this game I thought were really fun. They also just felt very stressful, and ultimately, while I think the game does sort of have a story trajectory, kind of like all like these Telltale games, like you're always going to get through everything in the story. I think there are a couple different versions of the endings that I sort of looked up after I beat the game that I think there is some weight to some of the choices that you do make that I found really, really fascinating and a lot of fun to know that, like, yeah, most choices did matter. The other thing too, and this was heavily in the promotion for the game, is they do have a couple legacy characters do appear in the game, even beyond the ones that I hinted at. The most prominent of which is Spock, and then there's a couple other cameos as well. But Spock being the most prominent, he is sort of has the likeness of Leonard Nimoy Spock, not sort of Zachary Quinto or Ethan Peck Spock. And because of that, they got a sound alike for Leonard Nimoy, which is a tough sort of role to fill for anybody, because Leonard Nimoy, I don't want to say he is Spock, because there are actors who played Spock wonderfully, but he is Spock to a degree. And it's hard to hear someone else do a sort of Leonard Nimoy impression, especially since Leonard Nimoy is one of my favorite actors and role models of all time in many different ways. But this actor actually really does a good job. I mean, he doesn't ever, let me put it this way. I don't think he's like delivering like top-notch like Spock performance, but he never threw me out either. I never listened to his voice and said, that's not Spock. That doesn't feel like Spock at all. That just feels like it sounds like, no, I never was thrown out of his performance. Again, not the most dramatic, but his role there is a little bit, as a sideline character, versus the much more interesting dynamics of our main crew that goes on in the game that are all performed really, really well as well. So that was really great. Again, there's a couple other fun cameos in this, and the characters are just all wonderful. Like, every character in this game felt fully fleshed out, interesting. I got very invested, and it explores like different aspects of Star Trek lore, which I want to talk about now. So if you have not played the game, stop here. I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend randomly the tie-in comic that's like a prequel to the game that like gets actually the events of this comic get referenced in the game itself a couple times and do have some influence. You don't need to read the prequel comic, but I thought it added some really fun context to the story if you had not had a chance to read it. But that being said, I'm going to spoil this all for you right now. So if you have not played the game, jump off here. Gonna talk spoilers for a minute. The first thing that I need to talk about here is the fact that the big twist of this game is that it's drawing from the episode The Last Outpost of Star Trek The Next Generation, which is the episode with the Ferengi, the first time the Ferengi showed up, where they're goblining around on that one planet with the crystals, and then it's sort of like the Takan Empire stuff shows up, and there's that weird portal dude who's like, I am the portal guy, like here to protect from the Takan Empire, that sort of nonsense.
Who asked the question? A guardian of the Takan Empire! Biped. Excellent.
It's a terrible episode, and what ruined the Ferengi for a very long time until Deep Space Nine. So no one really ever touches or talks about that episode again, but the plot of this game very directly ties out of that episode and the Takan Empire, and so you're sort of dealing with this resurgence look, there's the title, of the Takan Empire coming back in the modern day. It's got this sort of like eldritch horror invasion of the body snatchers type of deal that I always, invasion of the body snatchers types of stories always, I love those types of stories. Like, you can't trust anybody. They're some of my favorites. Like, the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers is one of my favorite movies of all time. And so I always adore that type of story, and this does it really, really well and interestingly, and in my mind, not even that problematically, because sometimes the stories can get kind of problematic, like people, stealing people's bodies can get into, like, conspiracy theory, anti-Semitic territory. This game doesn't really do that, which I found to be good. It actually kind of takes, like, more of a colonialist bent that I found really fascinating, and, like, you talks about eugenics in a way that feels more modern than Star Trek, especially even, like, Strange New Worlds this season got to talk about eugenics. So really loved that. And then we also they bring back the character of Portal 6-3, who is the, like, weird portal dude from the episode The Last Outpost, and they make him one of the most interesting characters ever. Like, legitimately, he has some interesting, fascinating ideology, some heartbreaking moments, and for me, in my story, he dies in one of the most dramatic fashions. I'm like, oh my god, I feel so bad for you, Portal 6-3. I'm just like, I never thought this random one-off nonsense character that from, like, a first season episode of Next Generation would become really fascinating as a character within lore, and they nailed it. I adored it so much. I was here for it. But even beyond that, I would love that they didn't just, like, go for nostalgia. They pulled a lot of, like, our Commander Rychek is from the character you play as the commander. She is from an alien species that I think was, like, a one-off episode, but they actually develop her further. Like, she needs to get, like, regular injections of an element that was, I think, referenced in that episode. And so, like, that causes problems and conflicts throughout the game. And so I love that they drew upon that lore. They also have a Trill character who I really love, one of your engineering friends throughout the game, who I adored her, but she's not a Trill symbiote. Like, she doesn't have, like, every Trill character you get all the time often is, like, a Trill symbiote character like Jadzia, and I love the Trill for that, but you get a couple moments with this Trill character where she talks about her problems with the symbiote program, like tying into her family and everything like that, and her feelings on, how the Trill venerate symbiotes and how she has a different feeling on that as an individual. Like, that was so interesting. You never get to see that from the Trill Society, and I love that development of the Trill in this game. So this game, while, like, sort of, like, in the world of nostalgia, of, like, oh, look, it's a Deep Space Nine era, sort of, like, post-Dominion War story that I think a lot of Star Trek fans want, but it didn't rest on that laurels. It didn't do, like, a Star Trek Picard Season 3 where it's like, oh, look, we got the Enterprise D back again. There is a Riker saves the day in the Titan moment that is, at the end of Picard Season 1 and Lower Decks as well. But it didn't feel like it took away from the main story here with the Resolute. It was just sort of nice, like, oh, Riker's here too, as opposed to, like, hey, Riker's saving the day sort of moment. So I appreciate that it was a tactful nostalgia in a way that I think Picard Season 3 didn't. And honestly, playing this game, which actually has a very similar story to Picard Season 3 in a lot of ways, it kind of makes me be like, man, I just wish this had been Picard Season 3. Like, frankly, I think this is a better story than Picard Season 3, even though it is very similar and kind of does similar things in terms of, like, playing in that era of Star Trek. But I think doesn't rely on, like, hey, the Borg are back doing the same thing or, other things like that. So, frankly, I think this is one of the... let me put it this way. If you are someone who has been, like, not loving Discovery, Strange New Worlds, I love those shows. But if you're someone even who's just like, I want more, like, post Deep Space Nine, even the Star Trek Legacy show that people have been clamoring for, I think that this game, it shows me what that could be, and I think delivers what a lot of Star Trek fans want. So if that's what you are looking for, from a Star Trek game or from a Star Trek story, if that's the type of, like, fan that you are, which, yeah, I include myself in that, this game will deliver. And I honestly hope that that this does well enough that Dramatic Labs gets a chance to tell another story with the Resolute, because I fell in love with these characters. I really love, like, Diaz, Rychek, all of them. I found just so good. Also, I ship the hell out of Rychek, and there's a Hotari girl that becomes, like, one of your besties throughout the game, and I ship the hell out of the two of those people, so I really hope we get to see more of them. But yeah, I do hope they get to tell more, because there is some unanswered questions at the end here, because people were taken over by the Takan, and we don't really learn if you can heal them from that. Like, depending on which way your story goes, for me, Diaz got taken over by Takan, the character you play as in the Lower Deck segments, but if you play it differently, the Trill friend of yours could also have gotten taken over by the Takan either way, depending on your choices. But it was devastating at the end there, and I'm like, I really want to explore what happens with that story. So there's definitely a lot more you could do with this. The captain also got taken over as the Takan. So, like, there's stuff you could play with in terms of developing that story more and doing just generally more stories with the Resolute crew, because I really loved them overall. So, frankly, I really, really hope that Dramatic Labs gets to tell more Star Trek stories, because this was excellent. And frankly, if they were like, we want to write a live-action Star Trek show, I would be here for it. So yeah, love Star Trek Resurgence. Highly recommend it. Highly recommend the prequel tie-in comic as well, if that's something that you're interested in, because I found it really interesting. Yeah, I hope they get to do more. But what did you think of Star Trek Resurgence? Let me know down in your comments below. Did you like it? Did you love it? Let me know. If you were celebrating Christmas or any other holidays around the time, Merry Christmas or any other holiday. Happy end of the 2023. I will say this channel won't have a bunch on it until the beginning of the new year, because I'll be traveling. I will be reviewing the Doctor Who Christmas special with Ncuti Gatwa, so be on the lookout for that. But otherwise, it'll be a little slower until 2024 comes around. So if I don't see you until then, I hope you all live long and prosper.